Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi everyone. I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education in the Office for Equity and Diversity, and welcome to One Nation or Many Nations in One: Racism, Romanticism, and American Indian Issues Today, part of the Office for Equity and Diversity's Critical Conversation series. This is the conversation, you may recall, that we had to reschedule from the original February 21st date, and it may be a little blustery out there, but it's nothing like it was. So I am so pleased that we were able to get back all of our panelists for this session, so we're very lucky today. The Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries, and our colleague Jody Gray in the back, yay Jody, is responsible for creating a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. This is our second year of offering these conversations, and we're excited to continue offering live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived again on that website. And we've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series, including topics that you'd like to see us do in the future, because we will be continuing. If you signed in, we will email you a link to an online evaluation, or you can access that also on our webpage. As with all of these conversations, we're going to start with some discussion among the moderator and our panelists, and then move to some question and answer opportunity with the audience. So for today's conversation, I'm very excited to be able to introduce a colleague that I've worked closely with and have tremendous respect for, Carl Lawrence. Carl is an enrolled member of the Sovereign Lumi Nation and Director of the Office for Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences, or what we call CFANS, here at the University of Minnesota. So welcome, Carl.
Well, hello, and I'm really thrilled to be here today. I've been waiting for this since December, so I've had a little bit of time to get excited over and over again. We did just have to move it because of the snowstorm, and for me it was interesting. I was talking with family at home yesterday and realized that we've gone out of Minnesota winter straight into Seattle winter, which is, familiar home country and home turf for me, so the weather feels just about right. But I am glad that we're able to come together today to host what I think is a really important conversation. Too often, the conversation around American Indians, American Indian life, and the context of American Indians situated within the United States, is poorly understood. And my hope is we get a little chance to talk a bit about that. As I was beginning to think about this and really reflecting on the role that this panel and we could play, I realized that I was starting to get angry. And the more I kind of thought about things, the angrier I got. So I began to realize, again, it brought back the reality of the process of colonization and oppression of peoples, many peoples, continent-wide. And as I really began to think about that and let that set in terms of the costs and consequences, the human cost and consequence, to friends, relatives, cultures, and communities, I got angry. And as I got angry, I began to think a little bit more. And in thinking about it, I began to work back a little bit and say, well, what is the cost to my own family, to my relatives, to the extended community that I come from, the intergenerational costs and pain of being colonized, not having had that happen once and done, but as an ongoing set of pressures to the people I love and hold dear in my life, right? It's an everyday cost. So I began to think about that, and as I thought about that, thinking about my relatives and the extended community of relatives, and by that I don't just mean my human ancestors and friends and relatives, but the natural world that my community lives in and experiences and relates with. And as I was thinking about that, it led me to my uncle, Forrest Kinley, or Dutch, as he's known on the Lummi Reservation, the Licktumish people. Dutch was a leader in our band, leader in the tribe, and it became especially poignant to me because he was one of the lead negotiators in a major case, the Bolt decision, which this year celebrates the 40th anniversary of. So as I began thinking about what this all meant, I asked myself, well, what would my uncle, who was an activist and a leader in his community, what would he have to share today? And that suddenly struck me as a really heavy responsibility, so I backed away from that pretty quickly. But I do think I can share a perspective that he would probably find significance with and endorse. And on an occasion like this, I think he would probably say that every generation has to find the leadership, it has to find its warriors, it has to find the spiritual and political capacity to continue the struggle, because the struggle will not let up. If American Indian people, if Native people of this continent know anything, they know that the struggle, the pressures of colonization, assimilation, extermination will not let up. And we experience that in many ways. And for me, I mean, he probably would, again, in sitting back, say, well, at this institution, for example, how often do we share the story of the Dakota people, the land upon which this institution is built? Something I'm sure that our panelists will share with you in a little more depth. He might talk about what gives the right to people to build over a 3,500-year-old settlement, Cherry Point out in Washington State, the largest coal terminal in North America, built directly over a dwelling site and a community and city site. Who gives the permission to do that kind of thing, destroying an ecosystem as well as a cultural frame and space for Native and Indigenous people? The pressures of colonization to Indigenous people of this continent are everyday and ongoing. They're not some other time or place. I'm struck by how often people will say, you know, it's terrible what happens to Indigenous people around the world. How can they do that? You know, how can they destroy their cultures and traditions? How can they take away the land that they've lived in for so long, where they've built their relationships, raised their families from time immemorial, as far back as memory reaches, and get all worked up about it, and then say, well, you know, in your own backyard, you don't have to drive very far. In fact, where you go to school is the cost of that here in the United States. How often do we have that conversation? And he would want that shared, I'm sure. Another thing he would want shared, without a doubt, in thinking of the University of Minnesota is, again, what gives a faculty member the right to assert academic freedom to do genetic research and potentially modify wild rice, a sacred gift given to the Anishinaabe people by the Creator, part of their origination, part of the creation story, the reason why the Anishinaabe people are here today? What gives a faculty member or a person the right to exercise academic freedom in the face of the kinds of social costs, the significant harm that we know will come about as a consequence of that, right? And these experiences are familiar to many of us from different backgrounds, but the story is unique in the Native American context. As a Indigenous people, people who've always been here and who suffered the ongoing costs in negotiating that space with another sovereign nation. And maybe with those comments, I'll turn it over to my colleagues to kind of build on that story and flesh it out with specific examples and then bring us into conversation. That sound all right? Okay, and with that, I think, I know that Darlene, you were hoping to be able to start the conversation.
I will go first. Mitakuyapi, ampetu kinde chante washte anapechi uzampie. Ye kiapi widemi washichi Darlene St. Clair makiapi. Damako ta chanshai pihi mataha wana chekpa ontue edwati. Ikje wichashta waunspe wichakya himacha St. Cloud wonspe wakantu St. Cloud wonspe wakantu ya edhtwani. Hello, my relatives. Today I greet you with a good heart and a handshake. I am Yekiapiwi. Yekiapiwi is my Dakota name. It's my real name. It means recognized woman. And my Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair. I am Dakota. I'm from a place called Chanshayapi, which means they paint the trees red. And this today is known as the Lower Sioux Reservation here in southwestern Minnesota. We're just about 2 hours away from the community today. I am, but now I live in the Twin Cities. I teach American Indian Studies, and I work at St. Cloud State University. I'm very happy to see all of you here today. So I wanted to talk, based on our topic, I wanted to talk a little bit about this place as a Dakota place. Of course, this university, the University of Minnesota, is built on Dakota lands with Dakota resources. That sort of fact is something that really should be within the understanding of everyone who works or learns at the University of Minnesota. And from my experience teaching Dakota Studies at the University of Minnesota, that wasn't the case. Many of my students were frustrated and angered, and these are students many of the students who grew up in Minnesota did not have that kind of understanding of the original inhabitants and the original owners of this place. So just a little bit of history. This land here that we're on right now is part of the 1805 Pike Treaty that was signed by Zebulon Pike and the leader of the Kaposia village, a Dakota village on the Mississippi River, which is very close to now it's St. Paul. So that Pike Treaty is actually not a very big treaty in terms of the land. It's about 155,000 acres, and Dakota people through this treaty got about 1 cent per acre. But what they held on to was the right to continue to use this land. And this is what the treaty says, that Dakota people would retain the right to pass, repass, hunt, or make other uses of the said districts as they have formerly done. And really, in that 1805 treaty, it was understood that what was going to be coming into that place was looking for land to build a fort. And I think for Dakota people, their interest was not so much in the fort, but they knew that what would come with the fort is an opportunity to trade for European or European American goods. And when, at that time, Dakota people are traveling to either northern Wisconsin or northern Michigan in order to trade for European goods, having that site closer to home was a benefit. Within this treaty, within the lands affected by this 1805 treaty are several very important sites to Dakota people. So one would be Dakuwakantipi, which is sort of known as the area around Coldwater Spring. In Dakota, that means the dwelling of something sacred. Wakantipi, which is now a part of the Bruce Vento Nature Area, or the Carver's Cave area you might be familiar with, and that's the dwelling of the sacred. Oheawahi, which is Pilot Knob area in Mendota Heights, and that Oheawahi means the hill much visited. Minneoesni, which is Coldwater Spring, which is right next to sort of the Minnehaha Falls Park. And Bedote, probably the most important place in this region for Dakota people is Bedote, which is kind of the confluence of the Minnesota-Wakpa and the Chachawakpa, the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. There's a confluence there. And that's really important to Dakota people because that is the place of origin of the Dakota people, where they came to be out of the earth, is this place. And this place is about 6 miles away as the crow flies from the University of Minnesota. So this is really in our neighborhood. The University of Minnesota, faculty, staff, students, and community members really should be aware that this is a Dakota place and the history of this place. And I think that's an area that we can do some work on. The University of Minnesota should use its position as a cultural and educational institution to sort of make those kinds of shifts. Of course, I'm working on projects related to this shift, but I think it's connected to sort of the kind of ahistorical nature of many Americans, where it's really, we can move to a new place and it's not important or even relevant to know the history of that place, to know the indigenous people of that place, to know the general history of how that place or how that state came to be a state. Now, I would recommend, and I think that there's been some efforts to do this, but I recommend that we take on as a protocol, a similar protocol that other nations have in terms of recognizing the indigenous peoples of that place as a habit. And it's not just to, and so this is done in Australia, but it's done in other places as well, where it's considered a protocol. And in fact, in Australia, the language is, respecting rights to culture includes recognition of traditional land. Therefore, traditional welcomes and acknowledging traditional owners should be performed at the outset of any meeting or event. Now, of course, the point of that is to sort of keep reminding people about the indigenous history of that place, for here, the Dakota history. And it's to address the sort of general marginalization of Dakota people, or the way that Dakota history has sort of been minimized or even eliminated from our understanding of Minnesota. But also, the other important part of that is to place others in sort of the big picture of the state of Minnesota. So if we recognize that there's indigenous people, then we also recognize that there are non-indigenous people. And non-indigenous, so then what we do when we make those understandings is that we understand that there are indigenous people and settler communities. And if we start thinking about that, we think about what's the story of those settler communities, what's the experience of indigenous people. And I really feel like this is what I really tried to get across in my Dakota History and Culture class, was that this is a relevant process wherever you live. This is not only important if you stay and live in the Twin Cities, but if you move up north, or you move to Canada, or you move to another country, or somewhere else in the United States, that this understanding of the history of that place and the communities within that place and the indigenous peoples of that place is something, that's a practice you should be doing wherever you go or wherever you visit as well. So I'm looking for this institution to use its weight authority to make sort of a shift, a cultural shift within the institution that I think will have an impact on our state. Now, of course, making this shift requires that we do some other things as well. And one of the things is that part of this shift is that we're making space for indigenous students, indigenous perspectives, indigenous values, and indigenous interests. And not a space that's marginalized, or not a space where indigenous peoples are expected to sort of fit in. And I think this is one of the big problems with educational institutions. I would recommend that we're making space based on how indigenous people say they need space, rather than, I think what we usually do is higher education institutions develop programs and expect indigenous peoples, and the aim of those programs is to help indigenous people fit into the higher education institutions. And in that sense, the University of Minnesota, as well as all educational institutions, are still assimilationist. We still might not have the same exact set of practices of boarding schools and mission schools, but in that way, we are assimilationist, even in 2014. So I definitely see that there's lots of opportunities to sort of be a part, either a supporter or a part of making this shift. Of course, that comes through student support, programs, courses, and curricula, making shifts there. A big room for improvement in terms of research. So some of this might come through the research questions that we ask. Who are asking the questions? What are the research interests of Native nations? Why don't we find out what Native nations have an interest? They have research interests. So why not talk to Native communities to find out their interests? The research design. We have sort of more standard designs that are based that are based on a sort of Western model, a Western European model, and we can ask questions about how is respectful and relevant research framed and conducted with indigenous people. I think then we have to ask the question about who owns the data, and that is something that many researchers and many scholars get very uncomfortable by, but I think these are conversations that need to be had. And then, of course, this is an institution that has a lot of both cultural and intellectual capacity that can be shared. So what kinds of efforts do we make towards outreach, and how are those efforts properly valued? The way that I think about it is outreach means we have expertise and we have we have ability to do certain things within this institution. How do we share that with other communities, like Native communities in Minnesota? Is one way to consider that. But I also want us to think about the opposite of that, which I would call in-reach, which is how do we as an institution pull in expertise from Indigenous communities? How do we pull that into this institution? And I think those two things, that outreach and in-reach, are things, there's a lot of room to develop good relationships between the university and Indigenous communities. Now, I don't want to just, I'm not here to criticize, because I also want to point out that the University of Minnesota is doing some very good things. Certainly, we have a student service area where there's student services, the Center of Indigenous Nations. And clearly, IFC a commitment to educating the university community, and even reaching beyond that to educate about Dakota people. And one effort that comes through the Center of Indigenous Nations, or COIN, is for the past 3 years, they have sponsored a tour of Dakota sacred sites. And this was a tour that I started working on this idea when the Native American Indigenous Studies Association meeting was here, and developed a sacred sites tour. And since then, that's been something that I've been working on. So for the past 3 years, COIN has sponsored this tour that I developed to take my students on. And I think Jillian and her staff understood that let's open this up and let's make this available to other people. So I think that's been a really good experience. Of course, the Department of American Indian Studies is doing some very important work in educating Indigenous scholars, and I think asking some of these more challenging questions about research. And I would also especially like to point out the many years that the department has put forward Indigenous language classes. I think this probably isn't well known on this campus, but the Indigenous language classes that are offered, the programs in American Indian Studies, are really two of the best programs in the nation for those languages. And that I don't think is really known on the campus. I think there's an assumption that, well, every college campus must be offering these in Minnesota, and that's really not true. So we really have to make sure that we protect and preserve and promote those programs. I want to commend the university for having the sense to have a diversity outreach librarian that really gets American Indian Studies. She while I was teaching here, she spoke to my classes as they were working on research projects, and to have someone on campus who really specializes in that, who can be a support to faculty, staff, students, and community, is really important. The American Indian Student Cultural Center is something that I think we have to make sure that we support and protect that institution, and make sure that students have an avenue for their sort of personal growth and finding a way to fit into the university. I know that in my own experience, that when I went to college, having a student organization that was active was a big part of my my emotional, academic, and intellectual growth as a student. And these kinds of student organizations are really an important way that American Indian students survive and, let's hope, thrive within the institution. I want to commend there's another student organization on campus that I've had some work with, the Student Initiative for Reservation Veterinary Services. And this is a student organization and these are all people who are going to be, they're getting doctorates in veterinary medicine. And so they've taken it upon themselves to sort of use their growing skills as vets and to reach out to reservation communities to provide veterinary services on reservations. I think that's a really great idea. To me, that's an example of that outreach. All right. I am involved in two nonprofit organizations, and both of these organizations have benefited from the work of the University of Minnesota. So one is called Dream of Wild Health, and it does indigenous farming, indigenous gardening, indigenous agriculture, and indigenous foods. And we have benefited from support from students and faculty at the University of Minnesota, especially Craig Hassel in food science and nutrition, and Bud Markart in horticultural science. I'm also involved in Dakota Wichocha, which does Dakota language and lifeways. And we have benefited from the Dakota language program and the courses in the Department of American Indian Studies over many years. And so we're grateful for the resources that they've helped us develop. So I guess I want to say that the university is doing some very good things, but I think we have a long ways to go in order to really make a paradigm shift. And so I'm happy to be a part of that, and I want to congratulate people on the work that they've done. But we're not done, and we need to keep working. So, Piramayaye.
Thank you. I think Darlene makes very clear that Native people have interests. They have strong interests in the places they belong and have always belonged. And one of the ways those interests are codified is through treaties. And treaties are an important part of Indian life, American Indian life. And so I maybe would like to ask, as our next speaker, Dr. Dave Wilkins, to share a bit of what is that idea anyway, this nations within nations? What's that all about? And why are treaties? We bring up treaties. They were basically written in the mid-1800s to late 1800s, and do they really still hold, and what's important about them? And the other piece I often hear is, why do Native people get special privileges when the rest of us don't? Why are they allowed to do this, that, and the other thing? And I guess in prefacing that, I also like to acknowledge that Dave shared with me that this hasn't been the easiest week for him, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and acknowledge that another one of the activists in the salmon wars on the Pacific Northwest recently went to the ancestors, and acknowledge Billy Frank again as another one of the coastal peoples who have fought long and hard to preserve the customs and traditions on the West Coast, where I know you have done some additional work. So, and maybe, at least from my sense, to honor that spirit with our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Thank you all for coming. Yes, in the semester, and we're all tired.
I'm sorry.
You need the
Dr. Wilkins, we need you to speak into the microphone. So we can capture
Okay.
the video.
Okay, is that better? Yeah, when we planned this for February, then that blizzard came down on us. I had a different kind of talk prepared, but things change, and we change, right, over the months. And so on Friday I had minor surgery, and so I'm just sort of feeling the after effects of that. And if I sound a little drug-addled, it's because I am. But then more depressing was on Monday when Billy Frank passed away. And he was 83 years old, Nisqually. One of the greatest men that I knew. He was part of that generation. He and Vine Delory were really close. Vine was my closest academic mentor. And he and Billy and Hank Adams, who's still with us, sort of were a triumvirate of powerful individuals, never seeking notoriety, never seeking fame, but working to protect and enhance the rights of Native peoples, to protect the earth, and to try and find ways to improve relations, and trying to teach the newcomers who came to their lands how to be human beings. And so I've been thinking about Billy since Monday, and I wanted to go to his service, and I would have gone had I not been sick. I would have missed this, but I really wanted to be there for him. But his passing and the kind of, and I've been reading all the, the obituaries about him, written about him, and there are a lot of them that are pouring out now, because he really was a titan. And yet whenever he was interviewed, and he was interviewed constantly and had involvement with Native peoples around the globe, and Obama even wrote a nice note for him on Tuesday acknowledging his life and all that he did. He would always talk about the fact that there were many people who were much smarter than him, and he referred to Vine sometimes as the policy Indian, And he referred to himself as a getting arrested Indian. He was arrested more than 50 times during his life, practicing his treaty guaranteed right to fish, right? The 1855 treaty that his people in Nisqually signed with the U.S. guaranteed them the right to fish at all their usual and custom places. And once the reservations had been reduced in size, all those usual and custom places were off the reservation, right? But they had written that into the treaty. And of course, once the state of Washington was established, they decided they didn't want Indians to go to those places. And they denied them the right to do that until the Bolt decision in 1974. And it was Billy Frank's active disobedience, if you will, and charged with all kinds of crimes of which he was not a perpetrator of, that led to the conditions that ultimately were changed because of his stalwart and warrior behavior and Vine's writings and Hank Adams' political and communication strategy and so on. And so it really is a sad day for all of us. But the treaty rights that he emphasized and that Vine always emphasized really are vital. I studied under Vine Delory in Tucson as a master's student. And he would always say that too many lawyers talk about jurisdiction as if that's the number one issue. It's not. For Native peoples, it's the treaty rights, because those treaties recognize our sovereign status as the original peoples. And so we have the senior sovereignty that is much more powerful than that of any state or the federal government or any other municipality that's come about since then. But frequently that gets ignored, of course, in the literature and in the law and in the public perception of what treaties are. And so I think it's very important that we remember, and I would encourage you to read some of the blurbs about Billy Frank's life and so on. But what he would tell all of us, which he would always do at the end of every Vine Delory symposium in July, which meets every year on the Lummi Reservation, is he would always say, stay the course, stay the course. Because he knew that the battles were never going to end, even though conditions have certainly improved markedly in the last generation or so. But they're never going to. It's never going to be easy for us, because the academy was not designed for us, was it? And our very presence in it is a constant reminder to the powers that have the power that we make them uncomfortable. And so I'm reminded of a quote that one legal scholar wrote, a guy named David Williams. And I read this to my students a lot when we talk about this unique, distinctive relationship between Native peoples and the federal government, and why it is that we still have all this constant tension of exactly what is the status of Native peoples, despite the treaties, despite our obvious existence, despite the reservations. Why is it that our status is still not solid? Why can we still not take our status for, and rest assured in that? And David Williams wrote an article for a publication on reparations in which he said, here's why I think reparations are never really going to be made for indigenous peoples by the United States, or even by the states necessarily. And I think there's a lot of truth to what he said. And here, I'll just read you the paragraph, because I think he really captures the gist of the difficulty that we face as indigenous peoples. He says, I propose a different explanation for the reluctance to grant reparations to tribal nations. They are collective sovereigns asking for reparations for the unjust taking of their sovereignty. But the United States is extremely reluctant to acknowledge that the taking of sovereignty was unjust, because America came into legal being only by that taking. All right? America could have territory for its own legal system only by displacing the legal system of the sovereigns already here. To call that displacement a wrong is to call America's own legitimacy into question. And it should not come as a surprise that the courts and Congress of the United States would be reluctant to question the basis of their own sovereign power. Indeed, American sovereign actors could not logically take sovereign action that would deny the legitimacy of their own sovereignty, because then they would have no ability to take sovereign action in the first place. And I think that captures in a very powerful way why there is always, I think, going to be tension. And while we have made improvement in intergovernmental relations, there are powerful forces in the corporate world at the national level and at the state level that are always going to be reluctant, hesitant, downright resistant to really acknowledging our right to be who we are in the lands of our own peoples, right? And so I think that's very, very powerful, that statement. And yet Hank Adams and Vine Deloria and Billy Frank never allowed that reality, even though they were very well aware of it, to hold them back or to prevent them from continuing to try to reach out to educate the non-Indians that they lived close by, right? I mean, Hank, just like Nelson Mandela, you're right? I mean, he's in prison for much of his adult life, right? And he comes out and he's willing to embrace everybody, right? And he becomes the president of South Africa, right? And he tried to reach out and protect the rights of whites as well as black South Africans. And Billy was the same way, and he would see him at a conference, and he would literally hug everybody. He was known as a hugging Indian, in fact. And he really did embrace people and really wanted to improve relations, and he gave his life to doing that. And it was his efforts, I think, that led Washington State to being the first state to come up with, to create a sovereignty accord in which the state of Washington finally realized that indigenous people's rights were in fact valid, were legitimate, and needed to be recognized by the state. And the state of Washington created an accord that has now been deeply institutionalized, and it set a precedent that a few other states have adopted, including our own Governor Dayton just last August. And you can't find it really very easily, and yet I was able to track down a copy of the Mark Dayton Sovereignty Accord that he negotiated with the leaders of the 11 Native nations in the state. And it's carrying on a tradition that actually was started by Jesse Ventura, right? When he wasn't giving body locks and headlocks to people, he actually got himself educated about the rights of Native peoples and was the first chief executive of the state to sign an accord with the Native nations here. Even Palenti followed through on it, even though he tried to, get around it multiple times. But Dayton has done this now in August, and we'll see whether or not it improves relations in a way that comports with some of the things we're talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. You set our conversation up so well, Darlene. You mentioned not only is place a very, very important aspect of American Indian life, but so is, what is education all about? How does education happen? What is that experience, as you mentioned, the boarding schools? So the experience of Native people in the context of the Western educational system has not always been positive and productive. The boarding school era was a time when basically the religions were given control of the reservation communities in many areas and charged with educating the children. And children were often taken from their families, taken from their homes, and located in boarding schools to be educated, to be taught white farming ways, to become productive citizens, to lose their language, to lose their clothes, to lose their traditions, and all the things that were central and important in their lives in the context of being Native people. So the educational system has not always been the most supportive and productive. So when you ask the question about what's going on and what could be done better here, in spite of the good efforts of doing a better job in reaching out to what is an effective education, I think there's still a ways to go. And I don't know who maybe would want to pick that up, but I know, Dave, that you were indicating earlier that you were, you work with the school district at this stage of the game and may have some views. Is that okay if we round down that end of the table? Good, thank you.
I'm just enjoying this conversation.
Okay.
Good afternoon, David Eichmann, the Shnikas. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Lakota Red Nation in Wisconsin, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. I was really happy to be part of this panel. I was surprised to be part of this panel after looking at the distinguished colleagues who were up here. Go, wow, why me? having been paired with these individuals, I've known them all for little bits and pieces over the last couple of years. I myself, I am a product of the educational system. With the Indian Relocation Act of the 1950s, which impacted my parents, which was yet another policy that was implemented by the federal government to help solve our problems. Thank them very much. We relocated here to the Twin Cities area, one of the many urban areas that Native people settled in. And so I went to school here at Adams School and started out there in kindergarten through third grade. And keeping in mind that our educational system is protecting our children, we have a school that's in a predominantly Native neighborhood, and the playground's right there. We used to go out and play on recess every day, and right across the alley was a liquor store. But that was allowed, that was tolerated back then. But in any case, the Adams School is where the American Indian Center now stands on Franklin Avenue. After I left there, they tore it down. So I kind of migrated eastward a little bit and attended Monroe School for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Left there, transferred over to a junior high, Seward, and in the meantime, they tore Monroe down. They didn't rebuild that one. They didn't do anything with that one. And so I completed, I think it was just a semester at Seward, and transferred to Sanford Junior High in the Twin Cities. And when I left Seward, they tore that down. I'm starting to get a complex. But they rebuilt that. They rebuilt Seward, and Sanford continues on. They didn't have to rebuild that one. And I did finally get my high school diploma from Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis. And then I went into service with courtesy of Uncle Sam. They came knocking on my door and said, "Hey, we need some bodies." I said, "Hey, what for?" And having an interest in aviation, I thought, okay, if I have to go in, I'm going to go into service. Figuring if I'm going into service, I'm going to go into service. I want to do some flying. I'm going to sign up for the Air Force, by gosh. 3 years, 8 months, and 4 days later, pounding the ground, hardly ever being in the air, I finally got out of service. And while I was in the service, I thought, okay, as long as I'm in the service, I can use the GI Bill to attain something that's near and dear to me, and that is with an interest in aviation. I thought, okay, I'm going to use the GI Bill and work on something in aviation, secure my pilot's license. And I made that decision early on while I was in the service. But unfortunately, Congress thought better of the GI Bill and said, no, you cannot use your GI Bill to go and fly airplanes. So I got out of service and I had the GI Bill and I said, well, what to do? So I decided, well, what the heck, I'm going to go to school. So I entered a junior college, secured associate degree, moved on to University of Minnesota, secured my bachelor's degree, and started working with the Minneapolis public school systems, working with a program for gifted and talented Native students. Did that for a number of years, and the university had a position open up, and I thought, okay, an opportunity here because they had a flight training program at the University of Minnesota. I said, okay, if I work there, I'm going to use the Regent Scholarship, and I'll get that. I'll work towards that aviation component yet. So I transferred to the university. I transferred my skills to the university, and they did away with the flight training program. So, anyways, I found a great group of people I was working with, and decided to stay on here for a number of years. And I worked in financial aid. And even with my peers in financial aid, I often wondered, and I did one time ask one of our conferences, our state conference, I said, just out of curiosity, how many here grew up wanting to be a financial aid person? I was the only one that had my hand up, and I had to pull that down quick. But in any case, our path, our journey, life's journey, takes us in many different capacities. I did get my license finally, and I do fly. And every opportunity I had, I did take people up who wanted to fly to try it, to give them an experience. And a lot of times it was met with an awful lot of oohs and ahs and wows and things like that. I like that. I like to get people to explore areas where they may not have had the opportunity or the privilege of doing so. Working at the University of Minnesota, I did transfer out of the financial aid office into the director of the American Indian Learning Resource Center, and spent a little bit of time there before transferring over. And by the way, they didn't tear that down. Before transferring over to Metro State, doing a little bit of work there, Augsburg College, and finally making. At that time, my family was grown, and I decided, okay, now's a good time to make somewhat of a career move. So I jumped into general aviation, and I worked there at Flying Cloud Field for a number of years, where we offered flight training. We fixed aircraft, sold aircraft, had aircraft parts, air charter. We did it all, and it wasn't too bad. Then 911 hit. It kind of decimated the general aviation, and so general aviation area struggled big time. And just about that same time, a former colleague of mine approached me and asked if I wanted to work with Sitting Bull College and working with the Red Lake Nation. And that sounded like a grand opportunity, and so I undertook that responsibility. And this was shortly after the tragedy on Red Lake Nation. So it was an enriching time period for me, because I was able to work with Red Lake Nation, and I still recall the first time I had conversation with community members there, as well as council members. They reiterated time and time again is that they are Red Lake Nation. They are a one nation, and that resonates with me. So I spent some time there before I ventured back into other aspects of higher ed. I worked with the systems office in the Minsky system, Minnesota State College Universities, until recently, and they did away with the position to reinvent that position. And I say that because that's usually what we are faced with education, within the confines of education. We are constantly training and retraining and retraining and retraining. And I often use this as an example with when I interviewed with the Minnesota State College University system, and I had the audience of the chancellor. I said, we're repeating, and we continue to repeat the process over and over again. And to me, it's like I'm flying an airplane. Get up, get airborne, flying along. All of a sudden, I look and my gas gauge goes, and I go, and that didn't work. So I go, and that didn't work. And I go, how often am I going to do this until I realize, by gosh, that is not going to work no matter how often I do this. Yet we continue to do that in education. We make those same types of decisions. Anytime we have a changing of the guard, we as Native people have to re-educate that person into what it is, in terms of what it is to be a Native person in this, our own homeland, in this on Native land, over and over and over again. And we continue to do that. I've had the same types of conversations with President Keller when he was here, let's see, I'm trying to think of going backwards in my mind where those presidents stopped and where my chancellors started entering in. But nonetheless, those same conversations were over and over again. We had to re-educate them about the Native nations within the state of Minnesota. And at one time, I had the opportunity to listen to Winona LaDuke, and she was addressing some students up at St. Cloud State. And she has such a knack for conversation, a knack for presentations. And I sat there and listened to her, and I'm always learning, always intrigued by people who who offer me insight. But she was right in the fact, and she picked up that same banner. So we're constantly re-educating on a routine basis. And she did an example that I kind of used in presentations with other educators within the state, within the Minsky system. I had the opportunity to visit a lot of different campuses and a lot of faculty, staff. And I would do a slight presentation with them, one that I think that it just to give me an idea where people are at. And so I think I'll probably try to do that with you. First thing I'll have you do is I'll have you close your eyes. And right about here, that's where people get real nervous. Strange guy in front of them, and he wants me to close their eyes, so they clutch their purses and other things. But in any case, I asked him, I say, we're going to take a little trip. Eyes closed, we're going to take a little trip. Let's go jump in this plane, and we're going to cross the pond. We're going to go over to Europe. And we stop in Europe, and I ask you, okay, before we stop in Europe, we're going to try and decide which nation we're going to stop off in Europe. Someone blurt out what nation you think of when you say European nation. I'm sorry? Anybody? England. Good. France?
Germany.
I'm sorry?
Germany.
Germany. Good one. Boy, this is a short flight, isn't it? Most people we go through and we can. You can open your eyes for a second. They can name all these nations in Europe, and they can name them, to Switzerland, Finland, you name it, Ireland, everything. Then I say, okay, let's jump back in that same plane. Okay, everyone, close your eyes. Let's come over here, back over here to the land of plenty here. Now I'm going to say Indian nations, and have you tell me which Indian nations you can think of. White Earth.
Standing Rock.
Standing Rock. Now you can always tell the group of Indians, they'll come up with okay, you can open your eyes. And when I use that, and you can tell the difference, we learn more about the European nations than we do about the nations here in the United States. And that's sad. That's a sad commentary. And if I ask people to name them, and as some of you did, and Winona used an example that just floored me, she goes, yeah, there's people who name the nations, when a native nation, they go, well, there's the Chippewa, and there's the Ojibwe, one and the same. There's the Dakota, and the Sioux, again, one and the same. And then they always come up with that. Oh, and don't forget the Cleveland Indians. But they use those as examples, and that's usually the extent of knowledge that people have about Native people. And it's so minute. And that scares me, because these same people that we are educating, we entrust to be the decision makers on Capitol Hill. They are the ones who are making decisions that impact Native nations, and they don't have a clue, or they have very limited knowledge in that regard. But that resonates in the educational field, because again, we continue to have to educate new leadership that comes in about things that impact Native people, and we have to do it on a routine basis, because we don't do an effective job in educating people in this country about the Indigenous people who are part of this history. And so we continue to work towards that. I'm working with the K-12. I spend a lot of time in the post-secondary arena, and we struggle with getting Native people through that level. They come into that arena underprepared. And a lot of the work that I did and worked towards was trying to find ways that we could, once they get into that area, that we can support them so they can have a chance at achieving in that environment. Being part of that whole area allowed me to start rethinking, where do we focus our energies? If they're coming in underprepared, why don't we start looking at the K-12? So I'm working with the K-12 environment, but some of the things that are going on in the K-12 environment are rude awakening. Just this past year, I've been invited to conversations where they bring me in as a Native advocate for Native students, and so by the time I'm involved with some of these things, it's like I got a 10th or 11th grader who is struggling big time, but when I look at how they got to that point, at least on the post-secondary level, you have prerequisites. If you haven't shown that you can master those prerequisites, you can't register for the next class. In the K-12 environment, they don't have that safeguard there. They kind of push you along anyways. So if you're in 10th or 11th grade trying to do math or science and you haven't mastered the skills prior to that, and yet the expectations are you're going to. So for half your school year, you're sitting in a class that you don't understand. You start disengaging. Your mind starts to disengage. You start thinking other things. You start wandering your mind. You can't do that work. You can't participate in that classroom. So by the time they get to that point there, they're already set them up for failure. And then me, being the magical native person that I am, I'm supposed to come in and fix it. And I don't know how to do that. Other than to call it what it is. Why are we doing this? And the solutions that were offered were, well, they can come early. Well, in that scenario, they can't. The transportation becomes a problem. Once you start busing and moving people around, it gets real difficult for them to participate. Well, they can stay late. Same issue. They can't because they don't have that freedom of transportation, that freedom that you and I may have as licensed drivers in the state. So the problems are real. Solutions are real difficult to handle, real difficult to look at, and try to find viable solutions. Yet we have, beyond that, we only have them for a short period of time during the school year. Just during the day. And once they leave the school, they go home to environments that aren't the most real conducive, in some cases, to a good, solid environment. We're looking at kids who have to fend for themselves a lot. Families are in positions where all they can do is battle for survival. When you're battling for survival, how do you plan for the future? How do you think the day, a month, a year in advance, let alone college? When you're a third grader, how can you think of college? How can you even think of something moving into that capacity? So again, the problems are many. There's a lot of them out there. How do we take these on? I think we are starting to position ourselves with the efforts of the 60s and things that laid the groundwork for us to take on some of these. I've talked to a number of people who were involved with Indian education, and Indian education in the country got their modest start here in the upper Midwest. And I've had the opportunity to either work with or talk to some of these framers of what Indian education is. And they positioned themselves to get us to where we are today. I mean, today, yes, our numbers are not the greatest. We have the greatest in terms of the opportunity gap. But on the other hand, today we have more Native attorneys, more doctors, more teachers than we had 20 or 30 years ago. But now we haven't we're starting to position ourselves where we can start taking ownership for a lot of this. And we have to, because right now, where Indian education got its modest start back in the 70s, recent data coming out of the federal government with regards to high school graduation, not this past November, the November before, in 2012, data was released that in the United States, Minnesota ranked 50th out of 50 states when it comes to graduating American Indian students from high school. And if that doesn't speak volumes, I don't know what does. Time for us to really take stock in our education. We take ownership. This is happening under our watch, and how can we let that happen? So, I'm just kind of bringing these things out there, things to think about today. I don't have all the answers. The fact that here comes Dave with a magic wand, he should know this stuff. Unfortunately, I don't. So I kind of thrust that out to you as you move through your discussion circles and things to talk about as to how can we as a start improving in some of these areas. I think one of the things that we can certainly look at is in Montana they passed a law that made Indian education for all part of their way of approaching education. So everyone knows about Indian education, not just Native people. We don't just Native people about Native, even though that's what we need to do because the atrocities that occurred during the whole boarding school era, where the cultures were just stripped from us, along with the culture of value, everything was stripped from us and played as something that was foreign. And then we were reintroduced back into our communities, and what we are seeing generations since is disparities in our own communities. We have very few first speakers of our own language residing in the state of Minnesota. We are starting to home grow some of our first speakers. We are reintroducing things that are important to us. We are seeing success in areas of, in terms of immersion programs, language immersion. There's a program in Leech Lake Nation. There's one in Hayward, Wisconsin, and they're showing promise. They're showing significant promise in the sense that these kids who are immersed in Ojibwe learn curriculum developed in Ojibwe, and they're seeing they've seen in terms of standardized tests, not only are they achieving, but they're surpassing surrounding communities in achievement tests in those communities. So there are elements out there that show promise, great promise. A lot of things that we need to do. I mean, I myself, I continue to advocate, continue to demonstrate that, yes, I am a product of this educational environment. Unfortunately, as a product of this educational environment, I do not speak my native tongue. I can understand it. I can interpret it. I can take it in, but I do not speak it fluently. The value systems that were once ours as Native people have been replaced. We're trying to regain an awful lot of that. The cultural aspects of it are so closely tied into our language, and there's a big effort on language revitalization so that we're looking at things and trying to right a terrible wrong, and at the same time position our children so that they can compete effectively out there in what the state of Minnesota is now working towards in establishing the world's best workforce. So I want to thank you for your time today, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you. And this is the time for you to kind of get your pencils ready, because we will have questions following Peggy's presentation. So if you've got things you've been thinking about as the presenters have been speaking, please feel free to jot them down. The other thing I guess I'd like to just quickly point out is that while many of the people we've been talking about as important people within the movements have been men, I promise you that in my community, the backbone of that community is the grandmothers and the mothers that make sure it all happens. Nothing happens without their approval, without them being specifically behind those ideas, without them initiating and ultimately deciding what moves forward. So I want to be clear about that the backbone of much of American Indian community life is the mothers and grandmothers and decision makers in leadership. But with that.
Bonjour. Peggy Flanagan, Anishinaabe, Guabagani, Ganikagnan, Dunjaba, Mangan, Dendode. My name is Peggy Flanagan. I'm a citizen of the White Earth Nation, and my family's the Wolf Clan. And the role of the Wolf Clan is to be the protectors of the community, which is why I do the work that I do. I am an alum of the University of Minnesota, and I'm honored to be in this room with some folks that I really respect and to be on this panel. And also Jillian Rowan, who's also in this room, is one of the reasons, who's now hiding, is one of the reasons why I survived the University of Minnesota. I'm also a recovering school board member from Minneapolis. So as we're talking about Indian education and politics and sort of all these pieces, that's something that I've sort of experienced firsthand. But when I was trying to think about kind of what I could bring here or sort of spark the discussion, I think what I really want to just talk about is the fact that we are still here. And as, many of us feel this responsibility to educate and frankly re-educate people all the time, that, it can feel a little exhausting. And what makes me continue to do it is when I think of my kiddo, of Siobhan, who's 15 months old and has recently learned how to play the kazoo. So there's a one-note jam session in my house all the time. But when I look at her, it has completely changed how on fire I am for the survival and the existence of my people. And, recently, Mayor Betsy Hodges, the mayor of Minneapolis, recently elected, along with the city council, got rid of Columbus Day in favor of Indigenous Peoples Day. which it's a pretty big deal. You know, they made that change in Berkeley, but you sort of expect that in Berkeley, right? Like, you know. But here, and it was really interesting. I normally make a rule that I don't read the comments under articles because it makes me lose faith in humanity, right? But I broke my own rule and I read these comments, and it was just remarkable how much more education needs to happen for folks who live in Minnesota and within the city of Minneapolis. And one of the things that came up repeatedly, and I hear this a lot, not just with regards to the Indigenous Peoples Day issue, but also when it comes to the Washington football team, or to the Cleveland Indians, or to the Braves, or et cetera, with this Native mascot issue. Oh, what's the big deal? So that's one. But the other one that I hear from natives and non-natives, primarily non-natives, is like, well, Native people or Indians have so many other things that they could be dealing with. You know, there's poverty or loss of language and all these, you know, all these other, you know, we sort of, it's like the bummer Olympics, right? Like the highest rate of diabetes or heart disease or all these other things that we're, you know, sort of like are outdoing each other in, right? But when I think about these issues, to have, you know, the mascot of our nation's football team be a racial epithet, right? To be a racial slur. What that does is it dehumanizes us as Indian people. And when you take away my humanity, you can treat me however you want. And so the fact that folks violate treaties, the fact that here at the University of Minnesota, we may not recognize and honor the fact that this university was built on Dakota land. It's easy to do those things when you take away the humanity of an entire group of people. So what, you know, just looking at like Donald Sterling, right, and his recent comments, the owner, not for long, of the Clippers, talked about, you know, he's kind of a racist guy, right? Was disciplined by the NBA, and yet we have this football team that continues to use this mascot. And it's like, what's the big deal? But Richard Sherman, the quarterback of the Seahawks, he's the quarterback, right? The cornerback. Awesome, thank you. So, like, I sort of know what I'm talking about. Okay. Said if the majority of the NFL was made up of American Indians, we'd be having a really different conversation as it relates to the Washington football team, right? Which is true. And so, you know, for those of you who are in this room who are non-native, what I'm asking you to be is an ally within this work. And that, you know, we always hear, oh, we make up 1.5% of the total population, blah, blah, blah. That, you know, in order for us to move forward, we need to partner with folks, we need to educate folks, and we need to re-educate folks constantly and consistently. So that's what I would ask you to be, is just an ally in this work, an ally here at the university as we are having intense conversations about student cultural centers and how we support American Indians and students of color, and that students of color are different from American Indian students, and just sort of honoring even that distinction between you know, political identity and as well as cultural identity. And I guess the last thing that I'll say is that you know, every day, we are bombarded with imagery, right? Every day, we are bombarded with imagery about what a Native person is supposed to look like or is supposed to be like. And LaDonna Harris, that many people call Mama LaDonna, who is a Comanche leader, the other day I teach a class at George Washington University, ironically at George Washington University, for American Indian students who are there for the semester in Washington program. And she met with my students, and she said something that has just really resonated with me, and I just want to leave it with you. And she said, you know, we talk about Native people, and especially young Native people, needing to walk in two worlds. And she said, frankly, I think that's a bunch of garbage. And I was like, oh, right? And she said, at no time do I stop being Comanche. And I was like, right. So it was like one of those like Oprah, Indian Oprah, like light bulb moments for me, right? And she said, at no point do I stop being Comanche. I am a Native woman everywhere I go. And every breath that I take is as an Indian woman, as a Native woman. And so that to me, and sort of the message to, to my students as well, was like, when we force ourselves to sort of compartmentalize or say that we have to exist one way here and exist another way here, we're denying or sort of, denying part of ourselves. And so just for the Native folks in the audience, I just want to say, like, you are Native wherever you go. And that, there is honor and there is responsibility in that as well. So just want to plant that seed, and just for non-Natives in the audience to think about, how am I allowing the Native people in the community and my life in this, in this state, in this country, to be Indian wherever they go. Miigwech.
Thank you very much. And can we give another round of applause to our panelists? Well, they've shared a lot as kind of an appetizer plate. And the main course is the piece that you all bring to it now. So what questions do you have for our panelists?
This microphone is cutting out, so we're not going to use it, I was told, but I'm going to use this one and just ask that you share that one.
So are there questions?
Comments or snide remarks?
Thank you very much for your time and your remarks. This has been a very interesting talk. And Darlene, I guess my question is for you. You talked about sort of changing the paradigm with which the university approaches Native students, changing from an assimilationist model to a more sort of equitable incorporation into the university community. Have you thought about what that might look like on a very practical level to sort of an incoming Native freshman, for example, and what might be a better way to make them feel welcome on a campus?
Well, I think it's a much bigger thing than a feeling welcome. I think it will be very difficult for any American educational institution to not be assimilationist. So I don't think there's any window dressing or anything we can do. I think some of those smaller efforts make a big difference. But I think if you talk to the folks on campus who are doing this work daily, both faculty and staff who are working either in the area of American Indian Studies or working in American Indian Student Support, I think there's always this kind of threat that Dave kind of talked about, that there's going to be a reorganization. And I think what often happens is we look at institutions, so I want to talk more broadly, and say, well, this isn't working, so let's toss everything out and we'll start over, but they start over with essentially the same model. And so when we recognize that, Native students don't do well in K-12 don't always do well in K-12 settings, and certainly the statistics are showing that for Minnesota. Firing the person who does Native education and hiring somebody else, but using essentially having the system be the same is sort of, it's never going to go anywhere. I think for Native students, I'm looking for something that's much grander. And that's why I'm calling it a paradigm shift, because it isn't just having a new program. Because programs, especially education programs that are directed at Native students, they might really have a great impact on the 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 students, but they don't change systems. So I think we have to make we have to look more critically at the system when thinking of it as an institution. And I mean, I think I have some ideas, and I think when I think about what I'm trying to do as a professor, I am thinking about how race is built into my discipline, how race is built into higher education institutions. I'm thinking about how colonization and the impacts of that affect me as a teacher, but also my students. And I do these little things in my classroom that I would call decolonizing strategies, things that I do in my classroom. But I recognize that I'm working within a system that has not made a shift. That I'm, making little kinds of, little hits at this system. And I think in the grander sense, these things, I'm hoping to have an impact on the students in my classroom, both the native and the non-native students, because honestly, I think other people have brought this up. We can do better by all native students, and we should, and we need to, but that won't change things for native people. Really, we need non-native people to make a shift as well in order for things to change. So, to me, in my mind, part of Indian education has to be how do we educate non-native people, because even native people who get that education, we still put them in these systems that are the same as they were prior, and I think those kinds of frustrations. So, I know that there's always this fear that programs are going to be eliminated, that positions will be taken away, and it's really difficult to grow something that can really change systems when you're sort of living in that kind of constant fear, and you're always looking to what you end up doing is, pleasing somebody higher above you in a hierarchy, and oftentimes that's not what's needed by the students that you're supposed to be serving. So this is a really big problem, and I don't have pat answers, but I do want to say that as frustrating as it is to constantly be educating people, for me, that's the institution that I'm invested in. That's where I'm putting my energy, and I want people to put their energy in other institutions that affect Indigenous people. But education is the one that's where I'm putting my time and energy. So I'm happy to I could talk about this for hours, but I think I bet other people have something to say to this as well.
So as that young student who came to the University of Minnesota, I have to say that what really made a difference for me was walking into a classroom and seeing a teacher who looked like me for the first time in my life, which I know is probably not an experience that a lot of other students have. And it completely, I'm going to tell you a secret. You can't tell anybody. I graduated high school with a 1.75 GPA. I graduated by the skin of my teeth and was, got into college on my charming personality and extracurricular activities. But because of that and learning about, Brenda Child was my first teacher here. And being surrounded by other Native students, being told for the first time in my life that I was smart, by another Native person, by an educator, that made all of the difference to me. And so while and the University of Minnesota is a land-grant institution, there is a responsibility to educate the students who come from here. And, when we talk about being a land-grant institution, that literally means that we have to educate the Indigenous people of this land. And so just even having Native professors understand that is one thing, but also having, as Darlene was talking about, non-Native professors understand that, and from the top down. And I don't know exactly what that looks like either, but I do know that the University of Minnesota, we talk about it a lot. It's ginormous. How did you go there? There's so many students. Just hearing that all the time. It's so big, but it's only as big as you make it. And I think that the reality is that there are communities here within the university that are not acknowledged the way that they should be. So that, I think, is a really good first step in being a welcoming place, and also knowing that the systems that are there that support Indigenous students will remain there. Because if I'm a Native student and I'm a freshman and I'm making the decision to go to, to the U or to another university, I want to know and have that security that I am going to have the support of this university and of communities and the Resource Center and the Student Cultural Center and other opportunities to, to hang out and be in community with folks that I can relate to. And I think this is especially important for Native students who come from reservation or rural communities to have that infrastructure and have that support. So to know that the funding will continue, that not only within the classrooms, but within the cultural centers, within the art, within the culture at the university itself, within murals, and, that the university reflects the students that it values from the top down, in policies and program, but also just sort of in the greater arts community as well.
I don't even know how to follow up on that one. Says it all. One thing that did cross my mind as Darlene was speaking, and as we continue to re-educate people around us, one of the things that we continue to, I continue to advocate for, and I'm following the lead of our elected officials, our tribal elected officials. They too have a firm belief in this, that even though when you think about it logically, it makes sense that if you have this umbrella of multiculturalism, that by nature, yes, the Native people should be included in that same umbrella of multiculturalism. And it's been tried, many years it's been tried, and every time it's been tried, whenever that occurs, the Native population loses out. Part of it is simply because we don't have the numbers to compete with any other ethnic group here in our own homeland. We don't have the numbers to compete with the non-Native. So when we are placed under an ethnic multicultural umbrella, now we are assimilating into that group as well. Yet there's very distinct differences as to who we are as Native people. And that gets lost in that multicultural umbrella. And so we continue to advocate that there separation from that piece of it, yet not to the point where it's exclusionary. We can partner with anybody in that context because we understand the battles and the trials and tribulations that go on with some of the barriers that these other ethnic group faces as well. But at the same time, we are still advocating and strongly fighting for our own position here in our own homeland to be recognized and continue to be recognized, and to advocate strongly that we have a connection to the affinity of this land, of who we are. And if we're under this umbrella, we get caught up in all these other issues as well, on top of what we are already looking to educate the non-Native about. So I just want to throw that out there, have people think about it, because I know institutions like the University of Minnesota continues to have in the back of their mind, yes, you're ethnic, you're brown skin, oh yeah, I'm multicultural, yeah, that's where you go, that's where you belong. But in reality, it makes it real tough to for Native populations to survive even in that environment.
Are there any other questions? One thing I'm looking at, just to get a quick feed from you, and it's a change of subject, but we talk about Indian, and of course Indian is a complete construction of, right, there were no Indians, as John Trudell says, there were no Indians until white people showed up to tell Indians they were Indian, to tell us we're Indian, right? In fact, what there were communities, were cultures, were nations, were contexts. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that notion of people want to see Indians and lump that into, again, a single group, but how does that representation really impact you or the communities you work with? How does that, having to own somebody else's label for you, how does that impact strike you? Lots of smiles. Maybe we leave that one, go at that.
Well, I know when I was first asked to be on this panel, and when I saw the title of it, One Nation or Many Nations in One, I mean, that in itself, captures some of what you're asking about. In fact, I had decided to retitle the presentation, and it should actually be titled Many Sovereign First Nations, 50 Federated States, and One Sovereign State, right? Because that's the reality of America. And yet, when are you ever going to see that on any brochures that the United States produces? See, it just doesn't comport, right? And we can try all we want to try and shift the paradigm from within the belly of this institution. It's not going to happen. But I've been teaching here, I've been teaching for about 25 years now. And when I joined the academy, I was under no illusion that I was going to be able to make any substantial change to the system, because it is what it is. And so, therefore, I hold out hope in individual students that I have interacted with over the years, with individual colleagues that I've interacted with over the years, and with the tribal colleges that are really doing the bulk of the important work that this university and other non-Indigenous universities need to be partnering up with if they are serious about wanting to expand their own intellectual horizons. Because it's at those 34 tribal colleges where they're doing incredibly important social work, scientific work, all kinds of art and media and everything else. And it's all done under the auspices of the native nation whose land it is on. And that's why I like every summer going to the Laureate Symposium, which is held on Carl's Reservation, Lummi. And it's a tribal college, and they're expanding like wildfire because they've got some revenue from judgment funds and from gaming funds, and they're just doing fantastic work. And so even though I've been here at Minnesota for 15 years, and our department, even though it is the oldest one in the country, right, 40 years plus, we can never rest assured that our status is going to be here next year, right? And that's always going to be the case because of that very statement I read from David Williams earlier, see. So I don't think we can change things, but I think we have to keep fighting against the tide, because the tide is going to be perpetual, right? For all the reasons that we've been talking about all afternoon. But what you try to do is forge relationships with individuals that you share a common affinity with, and you try to address the issues that you can, and you write what you can, and you talk when you can, and you hope that people will take what you have to say. But until and unless we can get this single state that we are surrounded by, although it is home to all these nations, right? And the way native nations are recovering their own names and redefining themselves by their own terminology is a powerful sign that is taking place even in the midst of an environment that doesn't want that to take place, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how it ultimately does play out, but none of us have crystal balls to know how that will occur. But the reality is that Dayton did sign this accord with the leaders of the 11 native nations, and I know when our students read in our class, Mr. Al-Curie, right, last semester, they had some optimism. They weren't very terribly optimistic about whether or not it would shift the political tide. But some of them felt like it was a step in the right direction, and certainly it was. But it's not going to be easy because there are vested interests that are always going to be opposed to recognizing the diversity that is, right? And that's just the way, what we have in front of us, and we have to deal with that. And as we've been talking, on the panel, you find your allies where you can, and you educate them, and they educate you. And then you keep trying to expand that a little bit wider, but it is going to be a tough sell always.
Well, I feel like we've really just touched the very surface of the last half hour, hour and a half that we've been together. Really just begun the process of sifting through issues that are really central and key to the American Indian community. So hopefully we have a chance to do a little bit more of this. And in any case, hopefully we've spurred you to really find out a little bit more. Do the ally work, find colleagues that you can visit with, do the research online, find out about those communities that are local to this place and how you can support the effort of maintaining those traditions and customs that are indigenous to here. So again, thank you all very much. And I'm in the uncomfortable position as a Native person. We actually started on time and ended on time. That's not supposed to happen that way. So thank you very much.